Welcome to the New England Hemophilia Association and the Hemophilia Alliance of Maine Back to School webinar. My name is Brandon Green, and I'm NEHA's Communications Specialist. I'll be the moderator for tonight's webinar. The objective of this webinar is to provide information about 504 plans, individualized education plans, and individualized health plans. Before we get started, I'd like to go over a few webinar points and helpful hints. Tonight's webinar will last approximately 1 hour. We welcome your participation and your questions. Your audio will be muted by the system for the duration of the webinar, as this will help eliminate background noise that may disrupt the presentation. If you have a question, we encourage you to use the question box on the bottom right of your control panel. I'll pass these questions along to our panelists at the end of the presentation. Our panelists tonight include 2 academic professionals from the New England bleeding disorders community. Kathy Cicinaro is a school psychologist currently working in Barnstead, New Hampshire. Over the last 12 years, Kathy has worked with students in preschool through high school to help determine eligibility for IEPs and 504 plans, and to support students with their academic, behavioral, executive function, and social emotional needs. Kathy and her husband, Rob, live in New Hampshire with their son, Shane, who has moderate hemophilia A. Chris Packard is a high school teacher working in Bangor, Maine. Chris has taught 6th to 12th grade math and science for 17 years at private, parochial, charter, and public schools in 2 states. Currently, Chris is teaching high school biology and AP biology at Bangor High School. Chris and his wife, Jill, live in Maine with their 2 sons, ages 11 and 15, who both have hemophilia. Kathy and Chris, I'd now like to turn it over to you. And as a reminder, in order for me to advance to the next slide, just please say next slide.
Hi, Brandon. Thanks for the introduction. I'm excited to do this along with Chris Packard and help everybody learn about going back to school and help their child with a bleeding disorder to be ready. When you are sending your child off to school, whether it's for the first time or if it's for the 10th time, it can still be kind of scary, and it can be difficult to know when and how to advocate for your child. So we're hoping to give you some tips and some ideas on how to make that an easier transition for everybody. Next slide. Oh, nope, stay with that one. Thank you. So one of the important things that we came up with was building a positive relationship with the school and with the staff. I think sometimes we can feel like we might need to educate others, which you absolutely do, but also kind of coming in with a defending your child or fighting for your child. And it's absolutely right to fight for what your child needs. But the important part is to come in and build that healthy relationship with them. Kind of like the saying, we get more flies with honey. I think I got that right. So it's just really important to start out on a positive note and develop that relationship. So one of the things you want to do is to educate the staff on a bleeding disorder. I know before I had my son, I had no idea what hemophilia is. And some of the staff that your child is going to be with may have heard of it. They may have heard of von Willebrand's or any of the bleeding disorders, but it's important to let them know what it means for your child. One of the ways that you can do that is to involve your HTC, and they can come in and do the education part and help you to advocate. You can also do this on your own with your child. You can go in and request a meeting to meet with them at the beginning of the school year, or even at the end of a school year to start and be prepared for the following year. I know I started the meetings when my son was right in kindergarten, and I always involved him, even though he was young. It taught him how to advocate for himself, but it also taught the staff to see him as someone who understood his bleeding disorder, what it meant for him, and to see him as someone that could advocate for himself as well. And by doing this, you're working to eliminate or reduce some of the fears that they may have and that you may have, because you've opened up the line of communication. And their fears may be, what happens if he gets a paper cut? What happens if I stumble over him and he gets hurt, or if he gets hurt on the playground? Are you going to be mad at me? So helping to alleviate those fears and also educate them that your child is not going to bleed from a paper cut, and explaining that it's okay. Kids, when your child has a bleeding disorder, they're going to have a bleed, and that we can't always avoid this, but reassuring them in how we're going to respond to that and what we're going to do. And the other part is heading off those what ifs and talking ahead of time about what to do in the event of a field trip, or if there's excessive attendance issues because your child is out sick due to a bleed, or if they're in the hospital because of a bleed, and also accessibility issues like if they need to use the elevator or they need to use crutches. And so having those communication things happen ahead of time is important. And we'll talk a little bit more about some of those issues as we go. Next slide. So what do you tell them? As I mentioned before, we talk about the basic facts. You're going to talk about the severity, but also what that means for your child. What kind of things do you feel are a risk for your child to do? What do you feel comfortable with them doing? And one of the things might be for phys ed classes, for gym class. Are you as a parent comfortable with your child playing in certain activities where they might get hurt or injured? And it's important too to find out from the gym teacher, what kinds of activities do you do? What might be the risk? What might be the most dangerous thing? And again, with my son, I think the most dangerous thing that I worried about was dodgeball. And of course, you're getting a ball thrown at you at high rates of speed, and it's going to hurt, and it could cause a bruise or a bleed. And you just decide whether you're going to be comfortable with your child playing that and having that conversation ahead of time. Sometimes I think it's also a balance of physical safety and also how your child might feel if they have to sit out and watch their friends too. So having that conversation ahead of time and deciding what you're going to do can make your child feel more welcome and more safe also. Make sure that the staff know what to do in the event of an injury or a suspected bleed, working with the nurse. It's important to use RICE, which if you're not familiar with RICE, it's rest, ice, compression, and elevation. So making sure that they're using that as the first response, and letting them know, do you want them to call you first? Do you want them to go ahead and infuse if they can? And not every nurse has that ability or the skill to do that. That's a conversation to have. So have a plan of action should your child have a bleed and how that's going to get treated. The other thing too is the kids might have questions. Why does Joey not get to do this? Or why does he sit out? And having them understand that this is your child's, their condition, it's their disorder, it's their confidentiality. And asking your child if he's okay with them talking to everyone about it. So respecting their wishes before kind of saying, well, he has a bleeding disorder. So kind of talking about what your expectations are for that and what is and isn't okay to say to others. As for field trips, planning ahead for that, you can talk about the nurse will let you know well in advance. And do you want us to pack the factor? Is the ice going to go? Are you going to be one of the chaperones to go? Will you infuse that day, or do we pack factor? So having those conversations ahead of time can ease their level of stress and also ease your stress, because if a field trip is coming at a time where you're busy, you've got a lot going on, it's going to feel kind of stressful for you to make those decisions on the fly. So have a plan in place. And one of the things that we're going to talk about, and Chris will cover this, is one of the plans that can help you to have that in place with your school. Next slide. So these are 3 possible plans to support your child. The 504 plan you may have heard, and this is based on the Americans with Disabilities Act. It is based on that law, and it's protected by the Office of Civil Rights. And we will go over that and what that looks like and some examples of what can go into one. Another one is called an Individualized Education Plan, or an IEP. This is based on IDEA law, or Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and that's through special education. The other one is Individualized Health Plan. And this is not protected by any law such as ADA or IDEA, but it is beneficial in helping to have a plan of action for the medical condition of a bleeding disorder. Next slide. So the first plan that we're going to talk about tonight is the Individualized Education Plan, or the IEP. And again, this is based on the IDEA law, and it provides special education and related services to students. They have to be identified as having a disability and one that significantly impacts their academic instruction and academic abilities. So for tonight, we're focusing on talking about individuals with bleeding disorders, because there are lots of things that can impact a child's academic abilities. And one of the qualifications that hemophilia falls under, one of the categories, is called other health impairment. You might also hear it referenced as OHI, because in the education system, we like acronyms and we overuse them. So OHI, other health impairment, first you have to have a disability. And our children do. They have a bleeding disorder, which is considered a disability under that category. But that disability has to impact their ability to make academic progress. So qualifying for an IEP may be a bit more challenging if hemophilia alone is the only thing. And most kids with a I referenced hemophilia. I'll have to correct myself because I should be saying bleeding disorder and recognizing everybody. So I apologize for that. Through an IEP in special education services, a student would be entitled to modified curriculum. So that means changing what they're getting for a curriculum. So for example, if a student is in 4th grade, and they might be being taught 2nd or 3rd grade math. So changing the level. Some accommodations might be extended time on a test, and a few others that we can review too. We'll give you some ideas of accommodations later. Specialized instruction, and also some related services like occupational therapy, which would be for some fine motor and sensory issues. Physical therapy for gross motor. Speech therapy, which can be for articulation, but it can also be for an individual's ability to understand language and express their knowledge through language, and also counseling. So those are things that are available to a student through IDEA. Eligibility is based on special education law, as I referenced with the law for other health impairment and the requirement for educational and academic impact. And if a student is identified as eligible for an IEP, they are reevaluated every 3 years to determine continued eligibility. Next slide. This is just a cute little pretty graphic that kind of explains the process of special ed, because it can be kind of confusing for everybody. So I wanted to just kind of quickly go over this. Referral for special education is the first step. Anyone can refer a child for special education evaluation. You can refer your neighbor's child. So if you could make that referral yourself. A teacher might make a referral if they have some concerns. Once the referral is made, the team needs to meet with the parent and the teacher, and you are part of that team to do what's called a disposition of referral and determine whether to go forward with an evaluation and look at qualification for special education. Every state has their own laws about how long that process takes and the days in between. I can only speak to the state of New Hampshire, that from the time that you make a referral to the time that you meet to discuss the referral, it's 15 calendar days. So it's probably roughly the same in other states. And Chris can, if he's familiar with the law in Maine, he can speak to that. So once you meet,
I believe it is about the same.
About the same, okay. Then if you do determine that you're going to move forward with an evaluation, again, it's different in every state. In the state of New Hampshire, we have 60 calendar days to discuss, to complete the evaluation before we have to meet to determine eligibility. So that's 2 months, and it can seem like a long time, but it really is necessary to do a comprehensive evaluation, get the reports out to you ahead of time, and then meet as a team to go over that. So then the next place is the eligibility. And as I mentioned before, that's where we determine whether there is a significant impact on education and academics, where we would actually say that it rises to the level of educational disability and that the student requires more than accommodations, where they may require specialized instruction or that modified curriculum for maybe some below grade level or changing what we're teaching them. If the student is determined eligible for special education services, then the team develops an IEP and decides what they're going to do for goals and in services. And continually, this IEP can be monitored and modified as needed. You have to meet annually to update the IEP. And as I said before, every 3 years, the team needs to reevaluate to determine eligibility again. Next slide. So this is where I hand it over to Chris.
Thanks, Kathy. Hi, everybody. This is Chris. The next one that we're going to talk about is a 504. And this is a part of a federal law that refers to the Americans with Disabilities Act, or the ADA. And it provides students with disabilities the necessary accommodations to ensure equal access to all school activities. So unlike the IEP, it's not a special education service. And so it's not going to provide specialized instruction. It's going to be more for making sure that people have access that might otherwise be difficult due to health-related concerns, as opposed to what are typically more cognitively related plans with the IEP. So the definition of a disability under Section 504 and ADA is significantly broader than the definition used in the law about the IEP's IDEA. To be considered for a 504 plan, a student must have a disability, an example, hemophilia or some other bleeding disorder like von Willebrand's. That limits one or more of the major activities, such as mobility, ability to attend, or otherwise receive access to education. So that's generally what a 504 is. If we could go forward to the next slide. In a 504, you're generally going to be diagnosed by a medical provider. So there's not going to be that 3-year evaluation, though you should have every year, you should review it with your school and go through the accommodations and modifications that you've worked out and review your plan for dealing with issues that might affect your students' ability to access school or any difficulties that might arise throughout the year. So in the 504 plan, there's going to be some accommodations that you would work out when you do this annual review. And these might be things like extra books at home to avoid carrying a heavy backpack, which could potentially cause a bleed. And I have students with backpacks that weigh like 50 pounds, and that's just a lot of stress on the joints that maybe they don't need. Access to elevators when needed. Of course, this is something that probably could be arranged and probably isn't needed all the time. But if there was a bleed and there were stairs in the school, a lot of times that might be something that they need, or extra time to get to a class. And these are things that might be able to be worked out informally as needed, but it's always good just to have sort of a plan so that you're ready to go when it is needed, because sometimes the people in schools are very rules oriented. And so, you know, just having this in advance and having it laid out is a very handy thing. So you might also ask them to be able to provide class notes if your student were to have a hand bleed and be unable to write, or some other way for them to be able to get down the school information. Maybe they need to type instead of write, or maybe they can't do either, or they need text to speech or something else. So that just that type of accommodations would be used in that case. Also, the ability to attend school events when the student is out of school during the day due to a bleed or a medical appointment. And so, you know, many schools have policies where students can't participate in extracurriculars such as dances, sports practices, sports games, if they were to miss a day of school. And so if they went to clinic or they were to have a bleed and need to go get an infusion, then they might have missed school, and then they would be disqualified from participation in whatever that extracurricular was. So this is the kind of thing that you can be sort of exempt from those normal policies, and it's exactly what the ADA law is meant to do for people who do have health impairments that are different than other people. So also the ability to see a nurse without question and without delay is an important one to have. So if a student, feels like they're starting to get a bleed, or feels like they're not sure, or gets hit in the head or whatever, sometimes one of the things that I've really noticed over the years is that a lot of things that happen to my sons that cause us concern or cause him concern or could be an injury for him wouldn't cause most people. And so, the caretakers, the teachers and the hall monitors and gym teachers, or anybody else that's there that they might talk to, might say, oh, well, you're okay, run through it, work through it, you can go after this, or can you wait a little bit? And it just really shouldn't be a discussion. And just having that codified sort of makes it something that people pay very close attention to. Also, if a student was to miss school for a long period of time due to a bleed or some other medical need related to their bleeding disorder, then they might be eligible for getting a school-provided tutor to get them caught up, or to have extended time in order to make up with those missed assignments if they were out. And then, of course, like Kathy was saying, you could also have in there about the gym class accommodations, and that's a really important one. So if they feel like they're getting a bleed, maybe they don't have to run at the beginning of gym class, and they can still participate in the parts that they do feel comfortable in. One of the things that's in our accommodations is we don't have like too many things that are like fully codified. We have, at this stage, my son, who's 11, has the most severe the most severe effects from the hemophilia, and so we have in there that he should be able to advocate and decide what activities he feels like he can participate in. So if something starts happening and he starts either feeling hurt or feels like this isn't a good thing for me to do, he can just say, and then without question, the gym teacher will let him sit out. And so that's just the kind of thing that I think is really good, is to provide yourself some flexibility when you're coming up with these accommodations in the 504, and just really encourage your student and you to be an active advocate, and have that directly worded in the accommodations, because otherwise there may be times where things happen that you otherwise don't intend. So if we could go to the next slide, that would be great. So 504s are generally a pretty concise document, sort of, giving major accommodations, but they're not going to provide a lot of details, and so about the hemophilia. And so it's really good to go along with your 504 is to develop an individualized health plan. And these are not legally binding documents. It's a health document. It's usually done in coordination with your nurse, and to make sure that it's going to be followed at all levels. Most school nurses are excellent, and you should definitely work on developing a positive, open, communicative relationship with your nurse. It's really important that you have the fact that you follow the IHP in the 504 as one of your accommodations. And so the IHP is going to outline sort of the responsibilities, trainings, and services required to keep your child safe, and how to respond in an emergency if one were to happen while at school, so that everybody would know and not be like, oh, I see that he's got a 504, and that's a bleeding disorder, and so what do we do? You don't want them to be wondering about that. And so we actually have like a laminated paper with our son's picture on it, and all sorts of things about his bleeding disorder and sort of the highlights from our IHP, but we also have more in-depth documents with this with our nurse. And so these are things that are going to talk about like what signs and symptoms of a bleed are, and talking about how our son is the best one at knowing whether he's got a bleed, what type of injuries are likely to result in a serious bleed or a bleed that's going to need to be treated. It's good for the adults to know, especially when he was younger, and it's good for them to have that to look at in case they wonder whether he knows at age 11, you know, what's going on as well. Also having the emergency care plan about like minor things like a paper cut. Everybody here is like, oh, hemophilia, if they get a paper cut, you know, that must be really serious. What are you going to do? Well, you could say, well, we'll just do some first aid and make sure that it doesn't re-bleed. And just, you know, having that, this is a forum in developing this IHP to, you know, really work out like what is minor and what is major, and when do you need a call. You know, I don't need a call for a paper cut, but if he gets hit in the head or he gets, you know, a twisted ankle or a jammed knee or finger, maybe I do need a call. And that would be something that you would want to work out with your nurse. And also when we go over our IHP at the beginning of each year, we always invite the teachers, and if they can't attend, we'll take the summary to them during conferences or as soon as we can to make sure that we touch bases. Kathy was talking about who can infuse. We've never had a nurse who was able to infuse, so it was always sort of like call us if it's like a major hit or injury, call 911 or a broken bone or something like that, but also call us. You might also put in your IHP, or you should probably put in your IHP, you know, where is the medicine that they use? Where is the factor going to be kept? Is your student going to have it with them? Is it going to be stored in the nurse's office? Is it need to be refrigerated like many medications do? And that stuff is, you know, should be worked out and should be available in case there is any emergency. Also, this is where you would talk about like field trips or like, you know, and talking about that you should be able to go with your student if they're young and it's any type of risky activity that you feel is risky, or, you know, just that you should have notice. And it might also talk about like, would they take the factor with them? Would you have done the factor in the morning? You know, what is the plan? So it's just the time for sort of planning and working everything out so that you don't have to do that when it comes up, because, you know, teachers who are in the classroom and nurses, they're caring for, you know, 20, 30 students. If they're a teacher on any given day, they're coordinating a lot of things. They have a life, they may have children, and sometimes these things fall through the cracks. So the more that can be worked out ahead, and the nurse, who of course is responsible for all the students, is going to be, you know, is a trained professional that can be a really great ally at your school, who can really help and make sure that things that a teacher or some other person who's watching your student might otherwise forget. So another thing that goes in IHPs is also trainings. And so like you might have different staff who monitor recesses or lunches. And so while your student's primary teacher or teachers may be well aware of your 504, the teachers the teachers or adults who are at this school supervising them at non-classroom times may have less information about that. And so this would, you know, and the school isn't just free to share information in a 504 or an IHP because of HIPAA, which is the Health Privacy Act, which is also a federal law. And so they can't disclose that private information to people who aren't immediately responsible for them, like classroom teachers or nurses or administrators. And so putting that in the IHP, that you need those people who will be responsible for your student and making the call whether they're allowed to go to the nurse, you know, if they're injured on the playground right away or not, are made aware of what's happening. So an IHP is really an indispensable tool that is a great way for you to build lines of communication and allies at the school. So if we could go on to the next slide. So a lot of times people get confused about IEPs and 504s. And so here's just a little Venn diagram sort of showing you that, so the Americans with Disabilities Act is this big, broad-reaching plan that impacts all sorts of things. So it's the big circle on the outside. And that's what Section 504 or 504 plan is part of, is ADA. So anyone who has a disability, whether they need special education or they have trouble learning, or they're falling behind in school or not, is still eligible for the services provided, legally provided in 504 to make sure that they have access to fair and equal educational opportunities. Schooling is a public service in this country, and so people with bleeding disorders have just as much right to be able to get there. And it's the same reason that we have elevators and handicap parking all around to make sure that places are accessible. And that's all stuff that's governed by ADA. And 504 plans are just part of that. And so people have a right to learn, and this is the primary tool that is used most frequently to address people's needs who have hemophilia or other bleeding disorders that cause disability. So if you need accommodations for those at any time, or you might need accommodations for those, any symptoms caused by bleeding disorders, then you would qualify for a 504. So having a medical diagnosis of a bleeding disorder basically automatically qualifies you for a 504. And this is true for work and school age, any age, whether you're at college, whether you're in preschool, even at work, you're protected to have access, reasonable access to the workplace or to school at any level of education, despite any disabilities that your bleeding disorder might cause or your family members' bleeding disorders may cause. So the 504 is really sort of the big tool. It has a little bit more legal weight. And then the IEP, which is done by an Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, is really sort of the law that's related to ADA, but it specifically addresses special education, like people who have cognitive differences and learning disabilities that impact their ability to learn and process information. And so you could qualify for an IEP with a bleeding disorder, but it would be more common to use a 504. So like Kathy was saying, there is that other health impairment. And certainly if you had like a brain bleed that caused cognitive differences at some point in your life, that may trigger an IEP being needed. And you can, and so that's just, that is a disability. It is a disability law, but it's usually related to learning differences. And so those learning differences would have accommodations that are related to specialized instruction, right? So you're getting information in a different way. You may not have to learn the same information. And this is really a school-based law. And so it applies to students who are in generally public education or publicly funded education. And it generally applies to people who are ages 3 to 21. And generally your IEP is done at high school graduation. But if you did have something in your IEP that was a medical condition, then you could potentially transfer that to something that would be applicable to ADA, such as the 504 plan in higher education. So, they can move back and forth, but it's not usual that they will. I've met people who have bleeding disorders with no real cognitive differences, or people who have children in this situation, and their school district decided to use an IEP, but it's probably a better plan to have a 504. because that's the broader thing and the thing that's really about health issues. So if we could go on to the next slide, that would be great. So sometimes, it can be, you've got IEPs, 504s, ADA, IDEA, and you've got these, all these weird words that are in there. So this is a slide that just sort of summarizes just some of the differences between these plans, because people can get really confused about what's going on and what they're going to be eligible for, what's going to be included, and what some of those words mean. So an IEP has specific eligibility requirements. You have to have a disability that meets the criteria under the law, IDEA, and it significantly impacts academics, right? And it doesn't mean that you're not, it doesn't mean that you have to be in the lowest level for it to significantly impact academics. It just needs to impact them in some way, right? Because we all think in different ways, and sometimes people might have dyslexia, but they could be like a genius. So they may just need specialized instruction, and they could be in the top level classes. So it's not just for people who are in what sometimes people think of as this traditional special education, this low level, just sort of learning to function. So it really does apply to a broad set of things. And number 3, to be eligible for an IEP, you also need to you need specialized instruction. And what that means is instruction tailored to meet a student's unique academic and learning needs. So I teach an AP biology class, which is the top level biology class at my high school. And sometimes I'll have students who have, I mentioned earlier, dyslexia, and so they need to be able to have the textbook. Formerly it was on CD, or now they need to get a PDF that can, be read by their computer to them, and then, they can score as high as anybody, or maybe they need to have the test read to them, or maybe they need to have longer time to process that, but they can do it. They can work at that high level, but they need a little bit different rules than everybody else. And so that's the kind of thing that you might find under an IEP, though it might also be like, you just need to learn life skills. And there's all sorts of different levels that can be included in there, but it is pretty broad. So what's included in the IEP is really that specialized instruction, related services, modifications, and accommodations. So you may also have health issues as well as learning disabilities. And I know some schools and some states probably only allow either an IEP or a 504. And so they might nest some of these things under one of the other. And so someone who has an IEP might also have hemophilia. And those, you would still need some legal protections to make sure you're getting the modifications and accommodations to be able to access school and access these public services that people who don't have these health impairments have access to. So a 504 plan, on the other hand, all you need to have is a disability that impacts life function. And so if you have a medical diagnosis of a bleeding disorder, you definitely qualify for a 504. And like I was saying earlier, the 504 has a little bit more legal weight and is longer lasting and has longer lasting protections. So if I was going to pick which one my son was going to go under, it would be a 504. And in fact, that's what he has. And so what's included is accommodations and sometimes modifications and or related services. So what's the difference between an accommodation and a modification? Well, an accommodation is how a child learns and how they access learning, how they access physical space, or what the rules are about that space, like attendance. And then modification might be something like they get, so it's like what they learn. Maybe they don't have to turn in all the assignments. They just need to demonstrate learning if you're in a proficiency school. And so they, if a student is out for an extended period of time, that might be a reasonable modification that doesn't change the information and skills they are supposed to have been learning. But they could be graded differently with that type of modification, but that would be less common and would usually involve like absences or something. So that's what a 504 is, and that's the difference between an IEP. So if we could go on to the next slide. So the conclusions of all this, we've talked about 504s, we've talked about IEPs, and we've talked about IHPs, is, whatever you have or whatever you choose to do with your school, you need to have positive communication with the school. You need to keep those lines open. You need to make sure that they know that they can talk to you and that you know that you can talk to them and that you're being heard, right? And like Kathy said, you're going to catch a lot more flies with honey than you are with vinegar, right? So, always start on the positive side, like you want to be their partners, because generally people in education are not in it for the money. They're in it because they want to do good things. And so if you can help them get those tools to help your child, they want to do that, right? But that said, don't be afraid to be an advocate for your child. You are their number one advocate, and you are the number one advocate that they be also their number one advocate, right? And so make sure that you're speaking up for what you need and that your child is speaking up for what they need if they have that capability. And have a plan before you need it. Don't wait and try and work something out after the fact. If you need it, look at the attendance policies, think about how they might miss school, what might happen, what kind of accidents, and just put a plan in place so that you're sure that your child's needs are going to be met, and it's not going to be some other thing that you have to deal with in the time of an emergency, when you have much more important things to deal with than navigating through school accommodations. You want to get that out of the way when it's not an issue, right? So, and you also need to be comfortable with your plan. You need to, leave sufficient flexibility or specific, or specificity if that's what you need. Whatever you need to feel comfortable that your student is being cared for by other adults when you're not there, and that you'll be included when you need to be included. So be positive, be an advocate, be prepared, and be comfortable. If you don't have any of these plans in place, it would be our recommendation when we were talking about this, that every child with a bleeding disorder, we think, should probably have a 504 that spells out some of these accommodations that we've talked about and some of these modifications. And it should refer to an IHP, and you should have a well fleshed out IHP, that health document, individualized health plan, that your nurse knows about what's going to happen in an emergency, knows a little bit more about hemophilia than maybe some of the other people at the school do, and that everybody knows that there's a plan in place and that it covers your child in the case of an emergency. And so, it is important to remember that a school is a big place. There's a lot of things going on. And so just keeping these plans updated, meeting with them every year, making sure that, nobody has any questions and that everybody who's supervising your child is on a regular basis is going to be familiar with this, is really important. And like Kathy said, if privacy is important, like it is to my son, that's included in those as well, that, nobody has the right to share your health information outside of, what you give them permission to. So you're in control of that. So be an advocate, be comfortable, be positive. And so if we can go on to the next slide, which may be, the next slide is about things where you can get like a back to school toolkit, because like I know my boys both start school tomorrow, and so if you need like what does an IHP look like? What kind of like things do I need to tell people? What kind of accommodation should I ask for? Well, so you can go back and check out this webcast again, or you can check out the resources called Back to School Toolkits that are found both on the National Hemophilia Foundation's website and the Hemophilia Federation of America's website. And those have lots of resources about all sorts of things, as hopefully you already know. And yeah, so let's go on to the next one, which I think is our questions slide. And Brandon, do we have any questions?
All right, we do. So now we're going to go through some of the questions that we've received from the viewers tonight. The first question is, are these plans only for K through 12, or should a child have one in pre-K too?
In preschool, students can have an IEP, the Individualized Education Plan, again, should they qualify. So that is a possibility there. As Chris mentioned, the 504 care, you can start that in preschool, and it does go right through high school, and then you can actually even have one in college, but you have to advocate harder for yourself there in that environment because it is a different situation and it's not a public school. But yes, you can have one in preschool and all the way through high school.
Okay, awesome. Let's see, the next question is an IEP needed with a 504 plan?
Chris, you want to take that one or you want me to?
Sure will. Yeah, so yeah, usually you're only going to have one or the other. And so the 504 is going to cover people who don't have cognitive differences that impact their learning in the regular classroom environment in a significant way, right? Everybody learns a little bit different. But your IEP is going to be for really somebody who needs special education services, and your 504 is going to be for your health impairments like a bleeding disorder. And so really you don't need both, and in some places you really can't have both, but they can kind of like do some of the things that the other one does as needed, because like I was saying, somebody might have like a brain injury or something that impacts their cognitively, or they may have like severe learning disabilities that they're born with that aren't related to an injury or anything like that, and they might have an IEP, and then they can put other health issues in there as well, which would cover the hemophilia. But since in those cases they would probably be mostly related to, in my examples, those are probably maybe serious things, and so maybe you would want to that would probably all go with the special education. I'm not sure what would happen, and maybe Kathy can speak to this, if you had like a more mild learning disability and you had hemophilia that were like, let's say you had, like my example from earlier, dyslexia. What would happen? You definitely need a 504, and you definitely need some non-disability related services that would be under an IEP. Kathy, how would your school handle that?
I can say in the state of New Hampshire, the DOE discourages us from having both an IEP and a 504 for one student. What each district does may differ. So some districts may say, well, we're going to give a 504 in addition to an IEP, so that they're two separate plans. But typically, let's say we have a student who has an identification for an IEP of specific learning disability, which is what dyslexia would fall under, and they also have a bleeding disorder. There's a part of the IEP plan where you talk about medical conditions as well as like hearing and vision stuff, and that's where you could list that the student has a bleeding disorder, and you could say see individualized health plan or see accommodations. And at the back, we could include accommodations for that student for academic accommodations as well as non-academic accommodations. So it could all be addressed in that plan, because whatever a student's identification is for special education for an IEP, you always consider the entire plan, whether it's 10 pages or 20 something pages, as a description of that child as a whole. So we can put anything in there. And I want to say, I want to jump in too and say, I noticed earlier, Chris, you talked about how the 504 carries more weight than an IEP legally. And I'm so glad you mentioned that, because a lot of parents kind of have that misinformation or assumption that special education in an IEP is heavier, and that they can fight that, and that's going to protect their child more. Whereas 504 under the Americans with Disabilities Act is a huge federal law, and it is more significant. And if a parent ever felt that their child's 504 plan was not being followed, they could file a complaint with the Office of Civil Rights. And when a school has a claim for a parent filing something with the Office of Civil Rights, it puts the fear in us. It's big. So a 504 really does truly carry more weight than a special education plan of an IEP.
Okay, thanks, Kathy. Our next question is, once a 504 plan is in place with the school, can it be modified or changed?
Can you repeat that, Brandon? I'm sorry.
Yeah, once a 504 plan is in place with the school, can it be modified or changed?
Absolutely, and it should be. They should be reviewing it at the end of every year anyway, or once a year. They're supposed to review it with you. And my son's has evolved and changed throughout the years as his needs have changed and his academic activities have changed. And as things come up, we're like, didn't think about this, didn't ever know that this would happen, so let's throw this in there. And again, that's part of developing that really good positive working relationship with them. So if you have questions or you want to suggest that something else gets added in, just request a meeting and that can be changed. It can be amended at any time as needed.
Sounds good. Next, we have a question here. What happens if my child already has an IEP for another reason? Can you have more than one?
So that's where if the child already has an IEP, the team could decide whether they're also going to do a 504 plan for the bleeding disorder, or they just put note in the medical part of the IEP that the child has a bleeding disorder, and then address the needs through the accommodations and the academic and non-academic type accommodations. So I think it's probably going to be up to the state you live in and up to the school district and how they do things.
Okay. And then our last question that we have right now is, when should parents start working with their school to put a 504 plan in place? Can it happen before summer break so that there's no delay in the school year?
What are your thoughts, Chris?
Well, I mean,
That gets tricky over the summer.
it gets tricky because people are really only contracted to work starting at the beginning of the school year, or a couple days before, and usually they're in all-day meetings. Usually you can get access to the teachers like very quickly at the beginning of the school year, but it is difficult to get meetings at the beginning of the school year. You could try at the end of the school year, the previous school year, if you know who your teacher is going to be, but where schedules change and things like that, or staff change, people move, you may be spending time talking to somebody who's not actually going to be, seeing you much, or they may forget everything over the summer. So, it is difficult to meet with people right before school. I know some people don't do anything at the school, don't ever watch. Some of the teachers I work with don't interact in any way with the school, turn off their email until they're contracted to come back. I don't think that's the norm, but that is not that uncommon. So I think you might have to be content with the first week or two of school, though you can always ask. It can't hurt to ask, for sure. So I would encourage you, if you wanted to do that, ask.
Administration is often in over the summer, so you could always say, I understand that the staff, the teachers aren't able to meet and the nurse, but can I meet with you? Or if they're not able to, then just provide them with some information. I just want to leave this here, this packet of information about bleeding disorders in my child, and then you can come prepared with any questions when we do meet. So that would be kind of a start. I did get the runaround when my son started school, and I wanted to meet beforehand, and a lot of it was to reduce my own anxiety, and it just didn't happen because of what Chris mentioned in contract time and summer work. And I kind of had to sit tight, but I did give them that information. And then they were able to meet with me and we went over everything. Probably, I think it was within the first week or two anyway of when school started. And then we developed a rhythm and a routine after that.
Awesome. All right, those were all great points. And thank you again for attending tonight's webinar. A recording of this webinar in its entirety will be placed on NEHA's YouTube channel in the next couple of days. The webinar will also be posted on both NEHA and HAM's social media pages. NEHA and HAM have a lot of upcoming events, and to see a full list, please visit each of our websites. NEHA's website is nehemophilia.org, and HAM's website is mainehemophilia.org. Thank you to Kathy and Chris for your work leading this webinar tonight, and thank you again for everyone for attending. Have a great evening.